The wind on Crowjaw Ridge didn't just blow. It had a name, the Black Needler. It didn't just sweep across the fields it hunted. It slipped through seams, found keyholes, and crept into lungs until it settled deep in the bone. Old-timers used to say that winter didn't kill anyone on Crowjaw. The Needler just decided when it was your time. Many roofs had lost that argument, and many graves had lost the fight. Now, another man was about to stand before its cold judgment. Funeral smoke was still hanging low over Mercy Bend when Tobin Reed learned that greed moves faster than grief. His older brother, Elias Reed, had been buried only 3 days earlier. A decent man worked into the ground and finished by pneumonia before winter even settled in. While the dirt on the grave was still dark and fresh, Elias's widow, Mara Reed, moved quickly. She claimed the cabin, the cattle, and every tool Elias had earned over 15 hard years. When Tobin asked for nothing more than a place to sleep, she threw a shattered lantern at his feet and barred the door from the inside. Neighbors watched through their curtains and said nothing. Just like that, a man becomes homeless before the funeral flowers even have a chance to wilt. If stories of hard people and harder winters still mean something, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and stand with Wild West wisdom, where skill is remembered and comfort is questioned. Morning found Tobin Reed, where the yard had left him, seated on an upturned bucket beside his bundled blankets while frost silvered the broken lantern glass. He had not slept much. Anger keeps poor company through the night, but it does not build shelter by dawn. What Elias Reed had managed to keep from Mara's grasp was almost nothing. No stock, no stored grain, no wagon, no warm room, only a folded paper in the county envelope box, and a claim few men considered worth the ink used to record it. It granted use rights to a narrow strip of broken ground high on Crowjaw Ridge, where an old coal drift had failed years before and taken 2 laborers with it. Since then, the place had carried another name more often than its legal one. Folks called it Dead Man's Shelf. The soil was thin, the wind constant, and the stone too stubborn for easy farming. Even goats were said to complain there. Tobin packed what remained to him. Then he started uphill. He had not gone half a mile before a wagon eased beside the road. Caleb Voss, owner of the warehouse and buyer of other men's misfortunes, held the reins. He wore sympathy the way some men wear gloves, only when handling unpleasant things. "Heard about your trouble," Caleb said. "That ridge claim won't feed you, warm you, or bury you proper. I'll spare you the burden. $12 cash." Tobin kept walking. Caleb guided the wagon alongside him another stretch. Bad ground is expensive to own. Tobin glanced once at the money purse hanging from Caleb's belt, then at the eager look the man failed to hide. A buyer does not chase what he truly believes is worthless. Without another word, Tobin turned toward Crowjaw Ridge, carrying the last thing anyone in Mercy Bend seemed too eager to take from him. Crowjaw Ridge offered Tobin Reed no welcome beyond open ground and broken stone. He stretched a weathered tarp between 2 leaning posts left from the old driftworks and weighted the corners with chunks of shale. It was not shelter so much as a pause between dangers. By first light each morning, he went hunting for heat. Not game, not fortune. Heat. He searched gullies for fallen limbs, hacked at twisted cedar bent low by years of wind, pried dead roots from thin soil, and bundled brush no man would have bothered carrying in better times. The labor was long. The reward was small. A full day bent over frozen ground might give him enough wood for 3 hours of decent flame, perhaps 4 if he fed it like a miser counts coins. Then darkness came, and the numbers turned cruel again. At night, the Black Needler returned to collect what daylight had allowed. It slapped the tarp flat against his face. It yanked ropes loose. It drove dust and sleet through seams no hand could seal. The little fire spent itself fast, bright for a moment, then mean and weak. Warmth gathered near the coals, while the edges of the shelter froze hard as iron. Tobin lay awake, wrapped in 2 blankets and all his clothes, listening to canvas snap like gunfire overhead. He counted how much wood he burned, how much he gathered, how much he still needed. The answer did not change. A man could not survive a full winter by feeding the wind 1 armload at a time. By dawn, he understood something colder than the weather. If nothing changed, Crowjaw Ridge would bury him before the month was out. Late on the fourth day, Tobin found a dry trunk wedged beneath a wall of broken basalt near the old drift entrance. It was too valuable to leave. He chopped at the branches, braced his boots, and pulled hard. The log jerked free all at once. His axe flew from his hand, skidded across loose stone, and vanished into a narrow crack at the base of the ledge. He cursed once, then dropped to his knees. The opening was little more than a split in the rock, low and mean. He had to turn one shoulder, then crawl in after the tool. Stone scraped his coat. Gravel bit through his palms. The light behind him narrowed to a thin gray slit. Then he stopped moving. The air inside was different. Not hot, not even truly warm, but steady, calm. It lacked the knife-edge bite waiting outside. No gust reached him there. No sudden sting touched his ears or fingers. The cold had been blunted. He drew one slow breath. The place smelled of damp mineral, old clay, and something deep that had not seen weather in years. It smelled like cellar walls and buried seasons. Tobin found the axe head by touch, yet he did not back out at once. He stayed kneeling in that cramped, dark space, feeling the stone around him hold its own quiet temperature. Outside, the wind shrieked across Crowjaw Ridge. Inside, the mountain kept its counsel. For the first time since Elias died, Tobin felt something stronger than fear. He felt curiosity. Back in the open air, the cold struck him again so sharply it felt personal. Tobin stood with the axe in one hand and looked from the crack in the stone to the tarp flapping like torn laundry. Something old stirred in his memory. Elias Reed had once spent a winter shoring up collapsed drifts for a mining crew west of Dry Hollow. He came home leaner, coughing black dust, but carrying lessons no school ever taught. On bitter nights, while mending tools by lantern light, he used to say, "The ground don't hate you, it just hates fools." At the time, Tobin took it as another hard man saying. Now it landed different. Elias had meant that earth could crush, flood, suffocate, or freeze a careless man. But handled right, it could also shield him. Tobin looked at his little fire ring. Every night, he fought to make more heat. Every night, the wind stole it faster than he could build it. He had been solving the wrong problem. The ridge did not need a bigger flame. It needed fewer ways for warmth to escape. Stone blocked wind. Soil changed slowly. Narrow spaces held steady temperatures. A man with little fuel could live better in a smart, small room than in a foolish, large one. No miracle had shown itself in that crack. No hidden furnace burned below Crowjaw. It was something better than magic. It was a rule. He turned and looked at the tarp again. It no longer seemed unlucky. It seemed wasteful. Like a bad answer repeated too long. The next morning, Tobin Reed did not go looking for firewood first. He went back to the crack, with a shovel, a pry bar made from wagon iron, and the stubborn mood of a man who had run out of softer choices. He was not building a house from nothing. He was correcting the shape of something already there. The opening was narrow, choked with loose shale, roots, and years of fallen grit. He dug the spoil out bucket by bucket. He scraped clay with the shovel edge, when the blade would not bite. He loosened flat stone with the iron bar, then dragged each piece backward on a scrap of canvas. Some rocks slid easy. Others moved only after an hour of muttering effort and ugly leverage. When a basalt shoulder blocked the right wall, he undercut the soil beneath it, wedged the bar, and leaned his whole weight until the stone rolled with a sound like distant thunder. Once it nearly crushed his foot. Once it pinned the bar so tight he had to dig it free by hand. The work marked him quickly. The old gloves Merritt had not yet given him did not exist in those first days, so his palms split open under grit and iron. His shoulders swelled hot at night. Both knees purpled from crawling on stone. He slept sore, woke stiff, and crawled back inside again. But the crack changed. It widened by inches, then by honest measures. Light reached farther in. The floor flattened. The roof rose where he chipped away weak shelves of shale. A cramped slot became a passage. A passage became a space with choices. On the sixth evening, Tobin backed into the chamber, set down his tools, and realized he could sit upright without bowing his head. He stayed there longer than necessary, hands trembling from labor, breathing the still air of a room that had not existed a week before. By the time Merritt Hale came up the ridge, Tobin had forgotten what it sounded like when another man approached without mockery. Merritt was an old farmer from the lower flats, broad through the chest, bent some through the spine, and weathered everywhere else. He led a mule, carrying feed sacks and fence wire, then stopped when he saw the widened crack in the stone. He stood there a long moment, studying the entrance, the spoil piles, the pry marks. The shovel leaned against rock. Then he spat into the dust and shook his head once. "That hole will turn colder than a coffin when the hard freeze sets in," he said. "Stone keeps no mercy. You ought to come down to town while pride still walks on its own legs." Tobin kept scraping loose clay into a bucket. "Maybe," Merritt snorted. "No maybe in it. Reverend Bell is opening the church hall once snow starts. Dry roof. Stove heat. Soup, if supplies hold." He glanced toward the tarp snapping in the wind. Better than dying in a crack. Tobin straightened slowly. His back hurt too much to do it fast. "Then another man can have the soup." The old farmer studied him again, this time longer. He saw no madness there. Only fatigue, stubbornness, and the kind of silence men wear when they have already buried someone close. "Well," Merritt said at last, "fool ideas still blister hands honest." He pulled a pair of cracked leather gloves from his coat and tossed them down. Then he took half a barley loaf from a sack and set it on a flat stone near the entrance. No sense freezing hungry. He turned the mule and headed downhill without waiting for thanks. Tobin watched him go until the ridge swallowed him. Then he sat at the mouth of the crack, tore the bread in two, and ate in silence while the wind worked itself useless around the stone. 2 days later, laughter reached the ridge before the wagon did. Caleb Voss came up the track with 3 town men and a mule team hauling empty crates. He stopped beside the spoil pile and looked at the widened crack as if inspecting a circus act. "Well now," he said loudly, so the others could enjoy it too. "The ridge rat has made himself a burrow." The men laughed on cue. One slapped the wagon rail. Another peered toward the entrance and asked whether Tobin planned to store nuts for winter. Tobin said nothing. He set the pry bar under a slab of shale and leaned. The stone shifted an inch. He reset the bar and leaned again. Caleb stepped closer. "You know what this looks like to sensible people? A man digging his own grave before the ground gets too hard." More laughter. "Still, I'm charitable by nature. I'll offer again. $10 for the claim, cash today. Enough to rent a room and keep from freezing like a trapped badger." Tobin moved the slab aside and knelt to clear loose grit by hand. Caleb's smile thinned. "You hear me?" The answer was another scrape of stone. Tobin reached deeper into the wall seam, found purchase, and loosened a second rock. He did not look up once. That silence changed the air faster than an insult would have. The town men stopped laughing first. They had come for sport, but labor has a way of embarrassing spectators. Caleb noticed it too. "I know what sits under this shelf," he snapped, then caught himself too late. Tobin's hands paused for half a second. That was enough. Caleb had admitted hunger where he meant to show contempt. Color rose in Caleb's face. "Keep your rat hole, then." He spun toward the wagon. "When snow seals it shut, don't expect Mercy Bend to dig." He drove off angrier than when he came, while Tobin quietly set the next stone free. Confidence came quietly, and so did the mistake. After widening the chamber, Tobin Reed began raising a dry stone wall along the outer edge where the crack opened to the wind. He stacked flat shale first, then heavier basalt above it, chasing speed instead of balance. By dusk, the wall stood chest high, straight enough to satisfy a tired man and solid enough to fool one. He crawled beneath the tarp that night, sore but pleased, believing he had finally turned effort into progress. The ridge corrected him before dawn. A deep grinding sound woke him. Then came 3 hard thuds in quick succession. Stone against stone. Stone against earth. Stone against certainty. Tobin rushed out into gray morning light and found half the wall spilled across the entrance like cards thrown from a table. The lower courses had kicked outward under weight. The top had followed without mercy. He stared at the ruin a long time. Hours of hauling, lifting, fitting, and bruising had become a pile again before sunrise. There was no one there to mock him. That almost made it worse. He kicked one loose block so hard it split the skin on his toe through the boot leather. Then he sat on an overturned bucket, with both elbows on his knees, and said nothing at all. The wind moved over Crowjaw Ridge, as if men and walls were equally temporary. By noon, anger had cooled into inspection. He crouched beside the fallen stones and studied the failure. Too much weight high, too little batter inward. No long tie stones reaching back into the bank. He had stacked rock like boards. Stone did not forgive being treated like timber, so he tore the rest down himself, every piece. Then he began again. This time the base went wider. Each course leaned slightly into the hill. Long stones crossed inward to lock face to mass. Smaller chalks filled movement gaps. Slow work, humbling work, honest work. By evening, only 3 courses stood. Yet Tobin trusted those 3 more than the whole wall he had admired the night before. On Crowjaw Ridge, gravity never lied, and pride paid cash. Failure had taught faster than success ever could. After rebuilding the outer wall, Tobin Reed worked with less pride and better eyes. He no longer asked what looked finished. He asked what would still be standing in January. The left wall came first, then the right. Each course leaned slightly inward, tied back into the natural stone behind it. Heavy basalt carried weight. Flat shale filled gaps. Smaller wedges stopped movement before movement began. He tested every section with both hands and all his weight. If a stone whispered loose, it came out again. The chamber deepened to 17 feet from the mouth to the rear bend. Near the entrance, Tobin could stand with his neck bowed only a little. Farther in, the roof lowered where old fracture lines remained. But even there a man could kneel and turn without scraping both shoulders. It was no grand cabin. It was better. It was efficient. He cut a shallow drainage runnel along the low side of the floor so meltwater or seepage would travel past him instead of through him. He laid broad flat stones on 2 short supports to make a sleeping bench above the dampest ground. Along one wall he carved a recessed pocket for kindling, tools, and the few dry goods he still owned. Another niche held split wood where stray moisture could not easily reach it. Slowly, the place stopped feeling like a crack men crawled into by accident. It became a room shaped by decisions, a room with purpose, a room that answered problems before they arrived. That night, Tobin dragged his blankets inside and lay on the stone bench with a folded coat beneath his shoulders. He listened out of habit for the tarps snapping overhead. No canvas cracked, no ropes groaned. Wind moved somewhere beyond the walls, distant and useless. He slept hard, and when he woke, dawn was already in the entrance. It was the first full night Crowjaw Ridge had failed to lay hands on him. Stone had given Tobin Reed shelter, but shelter without controlled fire was only half a victory. He cut and hammered an old oil drum into a squat little stove, patched the seams with clay and ash, then fitted the dented stovepipe Merritt Hale had left beside the entrance days earlier. He drove the pipe through a hole near the roofline and pointed it toward open air. By dusk, he was ready. The first fire lasted less than a minute before the ridge laughed at him. A hard gust struck the outer mouth of the pipe and shoved the smoke back down as if through a funnel. Gray clouds burst into the chamber. Tobin coughed blind, eyes burning, hands sweeping at air no man can sweep. Wet vapor gathered on the cold ceiling stone and began dripping onto the floor. The little stove hissed and sulked like an insulted mule. When the smoke cleared, he sat on the bench and studied the failure instead of cursing it. The black needler had not beaten the stove. It had exposed a bad line. The pipe stood where wind pressure was strongest. He had built an invitation for the storm to enter. For 2 days, he changed it. He widened the exit passage with hammer blows. He ran the pipe at an upward slant through thicker stone, then brought it out behind a shoulder of rock that broke the direct wind. He built a crude smoke shelf chamber where sudden gusts could lose force. Near the stove base, he cut a low intake slit so fresh air fed the fire instead of stealing from the room. The second lighting was quiet. Flame caught fast, then steadied. No smoke rolled backward. It drew clean and eager. The stove burned brighter on less wood than before. Outside, A thin gray thread rose behind the stone shoulder and drifted away harmlessly. Tobin stood in the doorway watching that smoke take the right path at last, like a sentence delayed by one more season. A warm room meant little if the entrance betrayed it. Tobin Reed knew that, yet he still rushed the first door. He built it from flower crate planks, cross-braced with scrap slats, then stretched old cowhide across the outer face to cut drafts. It looked respectable enough from 10 feet away. On Crowjaw Ridge, 10 feet was a dangerous distance. That night the temperature dropped hard and clean. By dawn, the door would not move. Moisture from breath, stove heat, and thawed snow had frozen along the jamb and lower seam. Tobin shoved with one shoulder. Nothing. He kicked. Nothing. He cursed the hinges, the wood, himself. Still nothing. The chamber was not yet a trap, but it had announced how easily it could become one. So he climbed onto the bench, squeezed through the narrow service vent near the smoke run, and spilled out into the snow like a man being born badly. He stood there in the bitter morning wind, half covered in soot, and understood the lesson plain. A shelter fails first. At the details proud men call small. He tore the whole door off before noon. Hinges, latch, frame, all of it. Then he built again. The outer door sat heavier and farther forward. 31 inches behind it, he hung a second inner slab on tighter pins. Between them he made a dead-air passage that trapped cold before it reached the room. Across that short chamber he hung an oilcloth canvas curtain to break drafts when either door opened. When he finished, Tobin lit the stove and waited through another sharp night. Morning came. Frost glittered outside. Inside, the latch lifted with 2 fingers. The outer leaf opened, then the inner, smooth and quiet. The air beyond stayed still. He closed both doors again and heard them settle with a solid final sound. It was the first laugh Crowjaw had drawn from him in weeks. By late November, the shelter had become what Tobin Reed hoped for, from the first crawl into the crack. Not comfort exactly, but advantage. Outside, morning ice held in the shadows until noon. Water buckets skimmed over with glass. Breath smoked white before a man finished exhaling. Inside the stone room, with no fire lit, the air held steady in the low 40s, cold enough to respect, warm enough to live. That difference was a kingdom. He tested it carefully. 1 armload of split cedar and root knots fed the little stove at dawn. He damped the draw once the stones around it warmed. By midday, the room sat near 60 degrees, and it stayed there longer than reason said it should. The walls took heat slowly, then returned it just as slowly. The bench stayed dry. The floor channel carried stray moisture away. Nothing was wasted except smoke. A candle on the storage niche burned with a straight, unmoving flame. No tremor. No hidden draft prowled the room. Tobin would sometimes pause in the middle of a task, just to look at that flame and trust what it meant. He cooked beans until they softened without hurry. He hung wet socks on a line of wire and watched steam leave them in thin threads. He sharpened his axe indoors with bare hands. Such small axe would have sounded like luxury 2 weeks earlier. That night, he banked the coals, pulled 2 blankets over himself, and lay down on the stone bench. He expected to wake often, as men do when cold has trained them. Instead, sleep took him whole. When his eyes opened again, pale light was entering under the inner door. 6 hours had passed. No wind had slapped canvas, no rope had snapped, no numbness had crawled into his feet. He had awakened not because Crowjaw punished him, but because the room was quiet. News traveled faster than wagons in Mercy Bend, and it improved itself on the road. By the second week, Tobin Reed was no longer a man living in a stone shelter. He was Crack Man, Ridge Rat, the Stone Hermit, depending on who wanted laughter and how much of it. Men repeated the names in the feed store. Women used them over wash tubs. Boys shouted them uphill, then ran when the wind answered louder than Tobin ever did. Caleb Voss enjoyed the telling most. He stood outside his warehouse with hands in his coat pockets and informed anyone listening that the first real blizzard would save the town the trouble of dealing with Tobin. Needler will freeze him stiff, he said. Then we'll dig him out like a rat from a grain pit. The crowd laughed, because crowds often do when one man lends them courage cheaply. Not everyone joined in. Reverend Amos Bell, the town minister, climbed the ridge himself with a sack of potatoes and a sincere face. He told Tobin the church hall would stay open all winter. There would be cots, broth when possible, company when needed, no shame in accepting shelter. Tobin thanked him with full respect. Then he declined with equal firmness. Bell looked past him into the stone room, at the stacked wood, the neat floor trench, the dry bench, the steady candle flame. He said nothing more. Some truths arrive before words know how to greet them. After the minister left, Caleb came by later with 2 loafers and another loud laugh. He called through the outer door that Tobin still had time to come live among civilized people. From inside came only the sound of kindling being split small and careful. Then the outer door shut with a thick, solid thud. Caleb laughed again, but less easily than before. 3 days before it struck, the sky over Crowjaw Ridge turned the color of hammered lead. Then the strangest thing happened. The wind stopped, not weakened, stopped. Laundry hung still. Smoke rose straight. Loose snow rested where it landed. Old men in Mercy Bend looked up from feed sacks and card tables and grew quiet. They knew calm like that was not peace. It was the pause before punishment. By afternoon, the battery radio in Caleb Voss's warehouse crackled with warnings from 2 counties west. Arctic front. Record lows. Heavy snow driven by sustained winds. Travelers advised to shelter in place. Livestock losses expected. Men who trusted little still trusted radios enough to hurry home. Then night came, and Crowjaw Ridge opened court. The Black Needler returned with friends. Wind slammed the valley in hard bursts that became one long roar. Snow did not fall. It moved sideways, fast and cutting, stinging any skin left foolishly bare. Window frames hissed white. Porch rails vanished. Barn doors shuddered on their hinges. In Mercy Bend, stoves glowed red, while rooms stayed cold at the corners. Fires demanded feeding every hour, then every half hour. Wood piles shrank like coin purses in a gambling hall. Men dragged logs indoors in shirt sleeves and came back rimed with frost. Women stuffed towels under doors and watched them stiffen with ice. Children slept near iron stoves, while bedrooms went dark and useless. The town's houses fought all night for every degree they held. Up on the ridge, Tobin Reed said little. He checked the outer latch. He checked the inner latch. He brushed snow from the smoke outlet and set 1 measured armload beside the stove. Then he sat on the bench and listened to the storm spend itself against stone. Near midnight, a sharp cracking sound rolled through the valley below. Then another. Then 3 more. Roof timbers, old and overloaded, had begun to speak their last language. Merritt Hale's farmhouse had stood through 3 generations of winters, which was why he trusted it longer than he should have. His father had added the west room. His grandfather had set the original beams by hand. Men had been born there, buried from there, and carried out wiser than they entered. But old loyalty does not strengthen timber. By the second night of the blizzard, 1 roof beam split with a sound like a rifle shot. Snow dust sifted down through the attic boards. By morning, a white seam had formed along the inside wall where wind found a weakness and worried it wider. Merritt fed the stove again. Then sooner than that, the room nearest the fire stayed tolerable. The rest of the house turned into storage for cold. He counted what wood remained. 6 good sticks, 3 poor ones, bark scraps. That was all. He stood over the stove and remembered laughing on the ridge, remembered calling Tobin Reed's shelter a coffin crack, remembered the steady look Tobin gave him in return. Another groan passed through the rafters overhead. Snow slid somewhere heavy across the roof. Merritt looked at the coals, then at the dark corners of the room, then at the door. For the first time in many years, his own house felt less like inheritance than trap. The thought of the stone room returned. It had sounded foolish when spoken in daylight. In that hour, with timber failing and fuel nearly gone, it sounded like mathematics. Stone, small volume, controlled draft, stored heat. Hope often arrives dressed like something once mocked. Merritt put on every layer he owned. Wool shirt, coat, oilskin, scarf, 2 pairs of socks, mittens under gloves. He took his hickory walking stick from beside the mantel and banked the stove one final time out of habit more than belief. Then he opened the door. Wind struck him so hard it drove him half a step backward. Snow filled the threshold at once. He pulled the door shut behind him and stepped into white death, headed for the man he had warned against. The road to Crowjaw Ridge had vanished before Merritt Hale crossed the first fence line. What should have been a walk of little more than a mile and a half became a blind war fought one step at a time. Snow stood to his thighs in the drifts and dragged at him like wet hands. Wind struck from different directions without warning and threw him sideways whenever he tried to straighten. He lost the path, found it, lost it again. More than once he fell full length and had to claw upward through powder packed hard by the gale. Near the ridge, standing became wasteful. He dropped to knees and elbows and crawled the last stretch, pushing the stick ahead of him like a spear. Then his gloved hand hit stone. A low wall, swept partly clear where the wind curled over it, solid, unmoved. Merritt followed it through the white blur until his fingers found rough planks set in a frame. The shelter still stood. He tried to call Tobin's name, but breath failed him. So he raised one fist and hammered the door with what strength remained. For a moment nothing happened. Only the wind screamed across Crowjaw Ridge and packed fresh snow around Merritt Hale's boots. He struck the door again, weaker this time. Then bolts shifted from within. Wood moved. A seam of yellow light appeared. The door opened, and warmth stepped out before the man did. It touched Merritt's face, like a hand laid there in mercy. Behind it came the smell of bean stew, dry stone, lamp oil, and clean wood smoke drawn properly through a working flue. No bitter backdraft, no damp rot, no panic heat, just a lived-in warmth, steady and unafraid. Tobin Reed stood in the doorway wearing a wool shirt with sleeves rolled to the forearm. He looked neither surprised nor triumphant. He simply took Merritt by the coat, pulled him across the threshold, and shut the storm outside in two practice motions. Outer door, inner door, latch. Silence followed so suddenly it rang in the old farmer's ears. The room glowed amber under a hanging lamp. A small stove ticked softly. Frost melted off Merritt's beard and ran down his collar. He tried to speak, but his jaw shook too hard to shape words. Tobin sat him on the bench, stripped off his outer gloves, and pressed a hot tin cup into his hands. Merritt stared at the straight candle flame in the wall niche. It did not tremble. He looked at the stacked wood pile, smaller than what he had burned in a single day at home. He looked at the walls that held their heat instead of surrendering it. Then he looked at Tobin. All the jokes told in Mercy Bend, all the warnings spoken on the ridge, all the confidence of men standing in dry weather. They had dissolved faster than snow on the stove lid. Tears came into Merritt's eyes from thawing, exhaustion, and something harder to name. They slid down his cheeks without a sound. When the shaking eased enough for speech, Merritt Hale wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked slowly around the room again. The low ceiling held warmth close. The double door kept the draft trapped in its own narrow chamber. The stone walls gave back what the stove had fed them. Nothing here was grand. Everything here was useful. He cleared his throat once, then asked the only question left worth asking. How? Tobin Reed glanced where Merritt's eyes had already traveled the stacked half-armload of wood, the stove no bigger than a crate, the tight seams, the dry bench, the candle burning straight as a nail. Then he shrugged as if the answer had cost less than it did. I stopped arguing with the cold. Merritt said nothing, so Tobin went on. Most men build wide rooms and feed big fires. Then they spend all winter chasing heat that's running out through cracks, roofs, doors, and foolish empty space. They think the fire is the master. He nudged one split stick nearer the stove with his boot. It ain't. Fire's hired help. He tapped the wall beside him. Stone answered with a dull, steady sound. Keep the wind out. Keep the room small enough to matter. Store what warmth you make. Let the ground change slow. Then a little flame works like three. Outside, something heavy struck the outer wall and slid away into the storm. Inside, no one moved. Merritt stared at the modest woodpile near the stove. He thought of the great stack beside his farmhouse, chopped all summer, nearly gone in 2 nights. He thought of rooms he could not afford to heat and space he had mistaken for strength. At last he nodded once, not to Tobin alone, but to a truth he should have seen years earlier. On the morning of the 6th day, the storm released Crowjaw Ridge as suddenly as it had seized it. Sunlight broke over a landscape bent and buried. Drifts stood higher than fences. 2 barn roofs in Mercy Bend had folded inward under the load. A stock shed lay flat as a deck of cards. Men moved stiffly through streets carved waist-deep in snow. Several carried blackened fingers wrapped in cloth. One boy's ears were lost to frostbite. No one laughed much that morning. Merritt Hale did, not with mockery, with the hard astonishment of a man still alive. He stood outside Caleb Voss's warehouse while townspeople gathered for news and supplies, and he told the story plain. He spoke of crawling to the ridge. He spoke of the stone room warm as a kitchen in October. He spoke of a fire no larger than common sense. He said Tobin Reed had saved his life without once saying so. Curiosity pulled more people uphill than kindness ever had. By noon, a line of men and women climbed toward the claim, hats low against the glare. They found Tobin, outside his shelter clearing the smoke outlet with a shovel, working as if no audience had followed him there. Caleb came too, unwilling to surrender the last word. He looked over the walls, the door chamber, the pipe hidden behind stone, and forced a laugh that found no partners. "Well," he said, "sometimes fools get lucky." Merritt turned on him with more force than the old farmer had shown in years. Luck don't draft smoke right, seal doors, and stretch a stick of wood all night. Silence fell so clean it seemed part of the weather. Men removed their hats without being asked. Women stepped inside the entrance one by one and came back out thoughtful. They saw no miracle there, only labor, judgment, and details done correctly. Caleb looked around for the crowd that usually stood behind him. He found none. Then he looked at Tobin, who had not paused work long enough to enjoy the moment. Caleb turned and walked downhill through the snow, speechless before the very people who had once borrowed their laughter from him. Victory did not sweep through Mercy Bend in a single afternoon. Some men admired Tobin Reed's shelter only until pride returned. Others copied what they understood and ignored what they did not. One family dug into a low, wet hollow, then cursed the idea when seep water chilled their bedding and mildew found the blankets. Tobin went down himself, shovel over shoulder, and showed them the first lesson they had skipped. Ground was not enough. Ground had to be chosen. So the change came the honest way, slow, corrected, earned. When spring loosened the ridge, 3 households asked Tobin to teach them from the beginning. Not how to build a hole, but how to read land. He showed them where wind curled and where it passed clean. He showed them how to cut drainage before walls, how to use stone mass instead of fighting for bigger flames, how a double door saves more wood than an extra cord stacked outside, how a room too large can bankrupt a family by January. Crowjaw Claim, once called Dead Man's Shelf, became a place people climbed for answers. Children carried lunch pails up the path. Farmers brought wagon bolts, hinges, and spare boards in trade for advice. Men who once laughed now asked questions with hats in hand. Tobin answered most of them with tools rather than speeches. Years later, the slope looked changed and unchanged at once. Along the ridge stood homes half set into earth, half risen from it, their roofs green in summer and white in winter. Smoke drifted low and steady from protected flues. Doors faced the weather wisely. Woodpiles lasted longer. Families did too. Tobin never grew rich. He kept rough hands, plain clothes, and the habit of speaking only when needed. But no door in Mercy Bend was ever closed against him again. Some evenings he stood outside his first shelter and watched thin lines of smoke rise from houses scattered along the hillside like they had grown there naturally. In those moments he understood that Elias Reed had left him more than a worthless claim. He had left him a chance to prove that wisdom is often buried before it is found. If you had been in Tobin's place, would you have crawled into that warm crack or trusted the town before the worst blizzard hit? Let us know in the comments.